I do tend to wonder when I speak, but I've been told to stay by the mic. So if you see me walking over there while I'm rambling about some dumb tech topic, please throw something at me and tell me to get back to the mic. Okay, that's your job. So my name is Raymond Camden. I work for IBM. My primary job at IBM is to make cat example code samples and stuff like that. And they have been fine with that. I think mainly because they just don't know I'm doing cat examples all the time. So I'm not going to tell them, so let's not exactly make this too clear. I actually do a lot with loopback and working with APIs, and we have a booth right there full of very cool people who can tell you all about loopback. If you come to me and ask about loopback, I'll show you a cat demo, so you may not want to see me about that. And I also do a lot of serverless stuff recently, generic web stuff, love the web, etc. I blog at Raymond Camden, cat examples again, and I tweet at Raymond Camden, and it's all very official enterprisey IBM stuff, so you should definitely follow me on Twitter. It's crucial stuff. So I want to begin by kind of talking about serverless and kind of talking about that name, because I have been hearing about this, specifically via Amazon, for probably a good year or so now, and it really, really upset me. Because in our industry, I'm kind of used to having names that mean absolutely nothing at all to do with what we're actually doing, like cloud. But at least cloud, I can kind of say, oh, it's a metaphor, blah, blah, blah. Serverless is like the exact opposite of what's going on here. Also, we have like Mintax. I'm kind of showing my age here, the original Dune movie. Anybody? Okay, a few people. All right, so the whole idea was that they had human computers that were doing all the calculations of mechanical computers. So unless we have that, there's still a freaking server involved. But I managed somehow to kind of get past that. And one of the reasons and one of the ways that kind of got me excited about it was looking at what IBM was doing with OpenWhisk. And they have this great paragraph that's like, I can't believe we wrote this because it's so sensible. It's like plain English. And I won't read from the slide because that's one of the cardinal sins, but I will point out that I see a lot of things talking about being relieved. So I have been in development as a web developer since about 94 or so, and we have a lot more tools now, and that's not always a good thing. So whenever you say that, you could take things away from me to make it a bit easier, I'm actually a heck of a lot happier about that. So I'm going to talk a bit about function as a service, which I think is a much nicer name and sounds a lot cooler, especially when you're explaining to some random cousin what you actually do as a job. Essentially, serverless to me means I write a function, and it does one particular thing, because we've all been taught functions should be nice and simple and do one particular piece of logic at a time. And here's where the fun part comes in. So the actual hosting of that function, making it available so I could actually use that function, all of that is covered by serverless. So not a great example, but I want to build a web app that outputs a random number. Okay, obviously you can do that client-side code, so don't do that. In the past, I spent many years using Cold Fusion. Ooh, years well spent, I can tell. All right, so imagine I said PHP instead. Everyone knows PHP, right? So you have an app server. You set up a file that will listen for a request, and it will spit out a random number. It's 2017, so instead I'm using Node.js. So I set up Node, I set up Express, and I make a route that calls my business logic of outputting a random number. That's not hard to do. I can fire up an Express server in 5-10 minutes, and I'm still a Node newbie. But that's still a lot of work to handle just all the metadata crap around a particular set of business logic. This is what has gotten me so excited. I don't like worrying about crap. I like worrying about the fun code and not about HTTP verbs and stuff like that. So I call my function, and then that's it. And obviously, there's a few things hidden behind those quotes and details that we're going to spend the next 35 or so minutes kind of talking about what that means. So I am using a product called Apache OpenWhisk. It is 100% open source, and you can contribute to it now. IBM was one of the primary creators of this, not the only creators, but one of the primary creators of it. This is free and open source and kittens and all that jazz. We're all happy about that. Just to make things a bit easier, I'm going to be running all my serverless crap on IBM Bluemix. IBM Bluemix is a commercial thing. That's what allows me to feed my 6 kids at home. So I'm using a commercial service just to run this stuff. You can absolutely run Apache OpenWhisk locally on your laptop and have fun there and do with it what you will. Okay. I will say, so everything I'm doing here today is free, so you can also sign up for free and use it for free, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I'm focused on the Bluemix path, so the installation I'm showing is going to be that way, and I'm not trying to make you an IBM customer, but you should be, because again, be my kids, but this is not the only way of doing it. In my mind, it's the easiest way of doing it. So you would go to this URL, and I've been told all the slides will be shared later. If you need it quicker, just find me because I'm right there. I'll be easy to find. You'll go to this website, and you'll see up in the upper right a nice sign-up form. And once you've signed up and told us your blood type and all that jazz and given us your credit card, you come back, and you'll have 2 options. You could work in your browser or work with the CLI. So I'm a real developer. I like my editor and all that. The web experience is actually pretty darn good. It has color coding and stuff like that. I don't think it will do like HTML hint or JS hint, whatever, but you can write code in there. I prefer the editor. That browser type thing, I'll show the example later. It will also be a place where you can actually look at the logs and see your stuff running. So it's not just an online editor, it's also like a portal to all the serverless junk out there. By the way, I'm not in sales, so I'm allowed to say junk and crap, it's all good. So you'll download the CLI, you'll see that I'm on a Windows machine. Wow, okay. I'm the only person here on Windows today. You can use Windows, you can use a Mac if you want to, I guess. A few people use Mac, and it runs just fine. It's not on NPM yet, so you have to download a file, which is kind of lame sauce, and then copy it to a folder that you could run later. I've already nagged them about making that a bit easier. Once you've done that, our documentation will tell you to do one step, and that is literally to copy and paste a command line. Nothing makes me feel more confident than when I copy a giant command line and just trust a giant corporation to run something as admin on my processor. That's all good. But all this is doing is saying, you're a Bluemix customer, here's your authentication information, I'm going to store it so that later on, all the actions, they know who you are. They go into your account. And again, you could literally just copy and paste that, and you're good to go. So the main focus for serverless will be what we call actions. These are the things that you're doing, the small atomic functions that will do one thing. Actions are, again, small, atomic. They should do one thing. I will say, if your functions do 2 things, no one's going to go behind your shoulders and look at you and say, really? I mean, come on, and spaces, not tabs? No. Your functions can do as many things as they want to do, but typically the idea is to make them small and simple and doing one particular thing. You can write them in JavaScript, or JavaScript. Obviously, I prefer JavaScript. Now, if you want to do Swift, you can do Swift. One of my coworkers back there, David, will talk to you about how wonderful Swift is. I think that's all day tomorrow. But I am just showing JavaScript because JavaScript 1, don't tell anybody. All your functions can also take arguments. That's probably no big surprise. But one of the things that is supported with OpenWhisk is the idea of default arguments. Here's an example. It's a function. It's called main and it returns something. So a couple of things to note here. You must name your function main. You can override that. You could say my function will be called cat instead. But by convention, and if you want to work with anybody else with OpenWhisk, just keep it called main. You can write more functions in the same file and call them whatever you want. You can have supporting functions that work with main, etc. You have to return a generic object like that. The value of the key there, output, totally arbitrary. It could be result. It could be message, text, whatever you want. And you could have multiple key value pairs there. But you must return an object like that. You can't return just meow. Make sense? Okay. So you have your file. How do we actually get it up on Bluemix/OpenWhisk? And again, you don't have to use Bluemix. So we have a CLI, and that will actually create an action based on a file. We also have a CLI that will update an action on a file. And if you're thinking already that sounds annoying, yes, it is a bit annoying. If you want to get all fancy and use a gulp or grunt script or whatever's cool nowadays to kind of automate that process as you save, automatically update, you can. I just hit the up arrow in my terminal, and that's fancy enough for me to send this stuff up. And again, the online editor actually would prevent you from having to do that because you're actually editing the resource on OpenWhisk itself. You can also test locally. I'm not going to show that today just because of time, but I'll point you to a script that I wrote with a coworker that allows you to do about 90% of your work locally and not do this constant file save, upload OpenWhisk, file save, et cetera, et cetera. So the command line is WSK. Action create name file. Name is whatever you want it to be. File is obviously the file that has your code in it. They don't have to match, so your action could be say hello, and the file name could be say goodbye.js. It's whatever makes sense to you. Don't be crazy. And the update command is what you'll use as you iterate and add stuff to your file and fix bugs that you will definitely create. Awesome. So how do we actually work with this? How do we actually run the action? One more command line called whisk action invoke name. This will be asynchronous, but there's ways around that. Good? Nice and simple. So most actions will want arguments. One main argument is sent to the function, just one. You can call it whatever you want, but it's going to be one. But you can pass multiple arguments where it gets collapsed into one arguments object. From the CLI, it's basically what you see on screen there. And that param file thing is where if you're doing some kind of heavy testing and have a bunch of functions or have strings you don't want to escape out on the command line, you can use a JSON file instead. But generally it's going to be param name value. And then simply update your code. All right. So I screwed up. You saw me. I do that all day long for free. So let's talk about async actions. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, wasn't it already asynchronous? This is enterprise async. This is fancy stuff here. This is advanced async. So essentially, this is an asynchronous action itself being called by an asynchronous CLI. So previously, the CLI was async. Now the code is going to be async. So what that means is simply, if I return a promise from an action, time to learn promises. Everyone here knows promises? Because it's already old, right? Now it's all RX. Too bad. If you've never used promises, come see me at the booth. I'm still kind of weird with them, but I can write them. But this is how you tell the OpenWhisk system that I am doing something that will be done a bit later, and I will either resolve or reject. So doing this by itself is all you need to handle an async type operation. So for example, I am hitting a remote URL and I want to parse it and do stuff with it and then spit that result out. So another kind of fancy thing that we could do with actions. So we built a really simple action that does one thing, which again is nice. We could also work with sequences, which is basically a way of saying, I have an action, it does one nice thing, but I typically need to run 2 or 3 in a row. A sequence basically says, I'll let you define whatever you want, A, B, C, and I will automatically chain them together. The command line just takes a tweak, and I pass a name of actions to use. And literally, that's it. The only kind of weird part to it is that your input and output must hook up. So remember when I said when you return that result, you could call it whatever you want, whatever key value pair makes sense. In a sequence, your output from action 1, if it's text and the value is my name is Ray, the input for the second action has to look for an input called text. Now, I don't like that. That has cohesion and makes me feel icky inside. I believe they're already kind of thinking about ways to let your actions be totally separate and build like a pipe between them. But if you use a nice generic output result and input result, then you should be fine. Just that's the thing that you will screw up first. So packages, just a organization type thing. When you make an action, by default, it's going to be in a directory called default. If you want to use a subdirectory, and I hate to say subdirectory because it's not a real file system, but you saw me when I listed all my actions. That can get pretty messy pretty quickly. Actions must have a unique file name, so I can't do hello and I expect that to work again when I create a new one called hello. A package basically says I'm working with cats, I'm working with client X, client Y, and it puts the action underneath that particular package. And literally, that's the only thing. When I call that action later, I just prefix it with the package name. So instead of generic hello SF, it'd be demos/hello SF. The only kind of interesting aspect of it is that you can set parameters for the entire package at one time. So that's useful if your package has a bunch of actions that are related. For example, working with MongoDB and you want to share a DB name default like amongst all of them, you can do that. And you can also share packages. So this kind of treads a bit on where if you run on Bluemix, we kind of help you out a bit. We have some packages that work with our Bluemix services. So with Cloudant, with a few other things, a few Watson services. By the way, just so you know, inside IBM, we call Watson by its real name, Skynet. A few people got that. All right. Yeah, marketing hates when I say that. So we have some packages kind of there for fun that you could work with, also weather data, for example, that you can make use of. And that's kind of part of this, the sharing aspect of actions that you get when you use packages. So yeah, there's a CLI to work with it. I won't show this because it pretty much works as you expect. You give it a name, you have a list, and you get various details about it. One thing I will point out, the CLI is making REST calls to the OpenWhisk server. Everything you do with the CLI, you can actually do REST calls as well. So if you have some very advanced usage where you want to make an action or invoke an action from a Node.js server, you can do all that. And we document what those URLs look like, how to send the authorization, et cetera, et cetera. So next big feature, triggers and rules. Triggers are just event producers. It means something happened. So a new email arrived. The best example I can think of, though, is the cron-based one, whereas the event is the time that you care about, once a day, once an hour, once a whatever, that fired, so let me do something. The rule is simply how you associate a trigger with a particular action. So if I want to do multiple things when something happens, like someone commits to a Git repo, I want to lint, I want to run testing, and I want to deploy to staging. I have one trigger, but I have multiple rules. So rule one would be, when this trigger is fired, do a lint on the code and make sure they use tabs, not spaces. Rule two would be run my suite of tests to make sure all the code pass. Again, all CLI based. I'm not going to show an example of that because it's a bit more complex. I will give you an example of what I built with it. In my hometown, our local police department outputs a list of vehicle accidents. So at the corner of X and Y, at time Y, there was an accident involving fire department, police, etc. So they have this little ugly little web portal where they built that. And I built a cron-based trigger where every 2 minutes, a rule says I want you to run an action that does a request to that and parses their HTML. Because Lord forbid they output JSON to make it easy for me. So I parsed it for them. I turned that into JSON data. I then run a second action that takes that data and drops it right in the Cloudant when it's a new report. So I have a bit of logic that says don't put the same accident multiple times. So the idea being is that now I have a database view of the accidents that are happening in my hometown, and later on I could build a report to see, like, for example, what the most dangerous time of day is. 5 o'clock probably, and what the most dangerous street corner may be. And I have all that example on my blog. Another one I built, also cron-based. I'm kind of obsessive-compulsive about blogging on a regular basis. So if I don't blog every 2 or 3 days, I wrote an action that will send me an email with like a frowny face and say, please blog. In terms of APIs, I actually just mentioned that. So there is an API for everything. You do have to use authentication. The CLI will show you all this if you want to. But we also have a new feature now that allows you to create a REST-based API where you will not need authentication. So that Star Wars API wrapper I built, I could expose that as a REST-based API without sharing all my Bluemix authentication data and all that. And I could specify the verb, I could specify the path and all that. And that's an example of the CLI. Obviously, this is a bit bleeding edge, so don't kind of base your multi-billion-dollar startup on that. But I give it a root API path, I give it a specific path, method, and the action that I'm running. This is working now, and it works pretty well. Like I said, it's also CORS-enabled, so it works great with JavaScript applications in the browser. Just plain works. So finally, the API stuff was bleeding edge. This is more bleeding edge. It's called WebbActions. It's a bit like the API feature, but kind of not. It allows you to output non-JSON data. So if you want to output an HTML string or HTTP headers or even an image, this is how you would do it. It's a separate API from exposing stuff via REST API, and I feel that's a bit off. But again, it's experimental. It's still being worked on. I will say this is how you can do binary data. Here's the fun part. You still return a base 64 string. But OpenWhisk handles saying, oh, I see you actually wanted a PNG. I will convert that to binary data for you, which I'm kind of fine with because the whole binary string thing is still confusing 30 years on programming. But again, this is really, really bleeding edge. The docs kind of talk about it a bit. But if you're curious about to do non-JSON responses, this is how you would do it. Practical example of this, I'm a big fan of static websites, something else I'd be happy to talk to you guys about at the booth. I built a form processor for static sites. I point my form at it, it takes the form data, it sends an email. In order to handle telling the browser to go someplace else, you need an HTTP header. This feature supports doing that and telling the browser now go to a thank you page. So in terms of pricing, there's a URL for all of that. We round up to 100 milliseconds, and it's 0. Blah, 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 blah per gigabyte second of execution. Gigabyte seconds is, again, one of those words I use when talking to cousins at family things that sound really cool. Long story short, it's extremely cheap. We have UI that will tell you, how much time has been spent. So if you're worried about the money and all that, you can see. Certainly, if you want to play with this and learn it, unless you do something really, really wrong, you won't get a bill. If you do something really, really wrong, first tell me so I can laugh with you, not at you, about it, because I think that's cool, and I could probably help you with the bill as well. It's free for all intents and purposes. So quick wrap up. There's a Slack because, of course, there is. I have a bunch of blog posts, some of them actually practical, most of them probably not too practical, but just demos of building stuff with OpenWhisk. I also have a blog post that shows you the command line script on how to test this stuff, and that makes working with this a heck of a lot quicker. The more you can test locally, the faster you can get things done before you push it up to OpenWhisk. There's a Visual Studio Code extension. It's not yet released, but it works just fine. So I can actually go into the best editor there is and say whisk action list and see all my actions. But that link will tell you how to install it. Again, it's not in the marketplace, but you can still install it. And that's your question about NPM packages. I already covered that. And the last thing I'll show in my last -0 seconds, I built a remote API called Fighter as a Service instead of Function as a Service. It's using a set of code by a person whose name is Don John. I assume that's not his real name. But he built a bunch of Dungeons & Dragons random generators, one of them being the ability to generate a random fighter. So for example, I can have a Wi-Fi failure. We'll just pretend that that actually worked, and you see a male dwarf warrior wearing plate armor and wielding a longbow and arrows. Again, kind of stupid, but I had this stupid idea about an hour before the presentation, had it done, had it up and running in just a few seconds. And if the Wi-Fi was working, it was working fine earlier. This is not IBM. Let's blame Amazon. Anybody here from Amazon? I always forget I can't badmouth tech companies in San Francisco. A chain. All right, awesome. So thank you very much. Any last questions? I know I kind of rushed. Well, I am out of time. Again, any questions later, find me at the booth. Thank you very much.